Good morning, everybody. This is the 2-minute warning, minute and a half warning, because we still have some people trickling in, but we'll be getting started real soon now.
All right, if everybody can take their seats, we'll get started here in a moment. You're doing.
Yep. Yeah, we'll get there. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and nice to see all these smiling faces, such as Oh. Hey, I see smiling faces. It doesn't matter whether they're actually there or not. Okay. On to the note one.
Oh, sorry.
So this is the arcing BOF, which if you were looking for something else, you've been confused by names and need to know that. The traditional note it well. Any questions about that? But I think everybody here knows all of what it means. Next, please. We have a mailing list that we set up for the BOF and the Jabber Room, of course. Dan has agreed to be our Jabber scribe. Thank you, Dan. Pete will be taking notes. Thanks, both of you, and your gold stars are at the front if you don't have them already.
Gave Pete the start.
Yeah. And we're going to get the blue sheets going, which we should have done before. So, sorry, didn't mean to have you running around in circles. Okay, so we're going to spend a few minutes on the motivation for the BOF, including sort of drawing some boundaries around things we're not doing, around distinctions we're making between what we're trying to do here and some of the other things going on this week and in the IETF. We have a couple of drafts that we've asked people to present in the interest of discussion and sort of starting to explore some problem space. And we've given them, enough time to present, but the goal, frankly, is discussion around, is there an interesting set of problems here? And is it possible to provide good guidance on solving them? But we will go over some of the thinking that's been done, and then basically there'll be a rush for the microphones or there'll be a rush for the door, and that will be good information to have. So, next please. It's a large chunk of text because I ran out of time to make it shorter, but if you look at the bolded words, basically a lot of the thinking that led into this BOF has been some issues that have come up in various contexts where we've had a naming in the internet which tends towards the assumption that that's DNS. But it's important to note that it does not, that the success and usefulness of DNS does not imply there will be a single resolution system for internet names. The most common internet names by far are those which are part of the domain name system, but that set of names is not the whole. And there are practical problems around that. There are some issues that have arisen where we need to start thinking, we think we need to start thinking about the implications of that and perhaps how to manage it better. Yeah, that's right. How is it a problem that we have multiple naming resolution? We have lots of name resolution, but again, at the high level, simply, there's lots of name resolution systems, lots of different things that people are using names for in the internet, and they have to interoperate. Those things have to coexist. And among other things, basically there are class problems around ambiguities in resolution for individual names. There are operational difficulties that can come up with regards to queries in the wrong context or in unintended contexts or ambiguous contexts. The other thing is that there has been, because they work so well, a tendency to use domain names in name resolution contexts that may not be as well suited. There are limitations on domain names that mean that they may not always be the best tool for the task, even when they're the most obvious. We do understand that this is very high, it operates at a very high level of abstraction. Frankly, it's easiest, at least initially, to engage with as an architectural issue. But what we came up with as where are the practical implications. First, there's protocol development that needs ways to construct, manipulate, and resolve names. There's lots of protocol development going on where people need naming systems, and they need to be able to think about what they need from their naming systems and have good tools for doing that. The point that name resolution systems need to coexist, we don't tend to think about it explicitly, but it's probably increasingly important. So the question that we've come to here, and the reason for having a BOF as opposed to sitting around drinking beer and discussing it, should the IETF describe and document best practices for identifying name resolution contexts? In other words, is there work here for the IETF, and how would we structure it so that it's useful? There's also a couple of things that we need to point out as sort of boundaries on this rather large and potentially confusing problem space. One is that I'm looking around the room, and many of the people in the room have been active in some work going on in DNSOP around a specific set of issues and the use of the special use names registry. There's carefully scoped work going on in DNSOP, and that's not what we're doing here. We're not here to fix DNS at any layer. And what we're hoping to stimulate is some discussion about potential solutions, potential useful things we can do that are a little bit out of the box, a little bit outside of how we've been thinking of these things so far. So next, I think that's it.
So with that, we should probably go to
Yeah. So we do have the drafts that we'll turn over to our authors in a moment, but they're all independent submissions. They can go wherever people need them to go to be useful. Is there interest in further work on these drafts? Are there additional drafts that people find they need to write to further the discussion? And we did ask very, very specifically, and kind of had to twist our AD's arm to have this as an IETF BOF. Is there useful work to do that could require a working group? So those are the kind of things we want to keep in mind, and we'll turn it over to our authors in a moment. But right now I see Ralph at the mic, which reminds me of one other note on the agenda I want to do. We do want to get through the presentations of the drafts into the general discussion about how they might fit together. So we're going to ask for clarifying questions with each draft, and then more general discussion afterwards. And Ralph, are you still at the microphone?
Ralph's still at the microphone with a clarifying question. Can you back up one slide, please? Do you have anything more that you can say about the relationship between this work and the work going on at DNSOP, or should we draw our own conclusions, or does it maybe not matter?
So if this room and the IETF in general decides to work on something in this space, and that solution is compelling and interesting as a way to solve this class of problems, it is possible that that might provide a way forward for some other things that are already in flight. However, what we're not specifically doing here is talking about any of those things in flight, or, oh, that won't work for that, or et cetera. So assume that those things are going to go on their own merry way.
Yes, great.
Unless this is compelling.
So you said something important there, which is if we do delve into solution space someplace, we should rule the other things that are in flight out of bounds for that solution space discussion.
For now.
Great.
Okay, so Ed, if you're ready. You need to stand in the pink box.
Is that good? All right, so let me go to the next slide. Actually, on the first slide I have how to find my draft. There are two ways. I'm lazy. I go to tools.ietf.org and do searches for it because I don't like to type the whole thing. Or you can actually get the URL there either way. So next slide. I have a draft on this topic, and I'll tell you, let me give you the structure of the draft first, but then I'm going to talk about the draft in the following slides. What this draft does is it first argues that domain names preceded the DNS and not the other way around. The DNS didn't rule domain names. Then it goes through the RFCs that exist and tries to find out how domain names evolved. Where do they come from? How do they get to be part of this and leading up to what was in the DNS system defined in the main RFCs for that. After that, I look at how have domain names been used as identifiers in protocols. And I have in here IETF documented protocols. That's not really true. I actually have protocols that are not documented in the IETF. It was just whatever protocols are out there, how have they used names that look like domain names and to see that, what's happened over time. And then finally, I suggest, based on what I found, a definition for domain names, which I am not proud of. I think it really needs to be discussed. That was kind of the point of this being a draft. And also, what drove me to do this was part of the alternative resolution context, which is the name of the BOF. How does that fit into domain names? I think those are two areas of my draft which are meant to be discussed. The other parts are actually researched to establish where we are today. So next slide. Okay, so what made me do this was the discussion middle of last year about .onion and the special use domain name registry, which we were just saying is out of scope. Okay. I thought something's, am I still, okay? Right. Okay, good. It didn't sound good to me either, but I really do. Because of that discussion, and not to get into it, but that discussion made me think about this whole issue. It's bothered me for quite a while. I've worked on DNS for a very long time. It always bothered me a bit. The question here is, does not the DNS define domain names? That's what I would have thought when I started writing this workup. So that's what made me start this. Next slide. I've worked on clarifications before because I start seeing that maybe we want to clarify domain names. That's kind of where this is going to go. And I have 3 rules for clarifications. They're personal. They're not anywhere documented. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is how I've structured the rest of the presentation. One is the original definition fuzzy? Many things are fuzzy, but that's not enough reason alone. 2, have many different people interpreted that original definition correctly, but in divergent ways. And not bugs. They just have different ideas from what was there. And then 3, is there a real need to come back, to reunify everything? You have to have, I think all 3 of those are needed before you go through the pain of clarification, because when you clarify something, you're going to change it. You don't just clarify, you actually go back and fix the definition. I've done it with a couple of things in DNS. And so I look at this as my prerequisite for deciding whether I want to go forward or not. And I think I've found those 3 to be met in my talk here. So next. So is the definition clear? Let's go next. First thing, RFC, and I kind of don't like using RFC numbers as identifiers for them because they don't tell you what it's about. But to give you an idea of the timing and the sequence of way things are, I left the numbers in here. 1034, 1035 is when we think of DNS as starting. That's the RFC, that's the standard 13. It says, here is the internet, here's the DNS protocol system, the rules and all that. In it has a phrase which always bugged me saying, to simplify implementations, all of this stuff is done. And for many years, I didn't think about that. But the idea is there was something there before 1034. We were simplifying the world to just get it into code. So very important clue right there. If you go through the draft, it goes a little more deeper in reverse engineering. That definition say, no, it wasn't the DNS that created domain names. They came from somewhere else. And you go back through some of the references, I find, you go back in history now. RFC 788, again, just to give you the sequence of time, the first time the name domain was mentioned in the context of sending mailboxes. In the next couple of RFCs you see listed up there, there are further and further mentions of domain names. The name quickly was reversed, and what they look like, examples of that. And quickly we got to something that looks a lot like what we see today as a domain. If you look at a picture of a domain name, what you see there is in these documents. To contrast this though, the DNS did not appear for yet another quite a few RFCs in time. So it was even after the names had come down, and it was for mail. We were doing this under the tent of mail. Next slide. So the definition, is it clear? Well, it's hierarchical. That's one thing we know about domain names. They were definitely always multi-part composite name fields with separators and whatnot. But beyond that, no formal syntax anywhere. There was never anyone trying to say this is exactly what they are. Nothing about the length of the names, what's the content of the names. Nothing about wire formatting, which being a DNS person, I'm using wire formats where you have a very old protocol. Rules on the length, non-ASCII characters, none of that was discussed, even considered in the original definitions. And there was certainly no formal definition or offered anywhere. Only the notion of hierarchy and the top level of that. Those are the two things. And also in there, I should add, ARPA was defined as a top level name, not even top level domain. Top level name was what was used back in those days. So that's kind of the history of what's in the documents. Others may have memories, but these are what's actually written down. So I think it's kind of fuzzy. So are there non-interoperable valid interpretations? I have in this part of the draft, there are 10 bullet points of 10 different use cases I see of domain names being used in one way or another. And bullet point 11 is others. So there's more than 10, there's easily more than 10. To jog your mind here, without trying to give you a laundry list of all of these, it gets boring to do that, but there's one of the constant debates, if you're used to this area, there's a domain name versus a host name. That's a perennial argument in people dealing with even just the DNS. Host names are letter, digit, hyphen, that's the LDH, that's a restricted number, restricted character set for that. URI authority, when you get into the web, the URI authority field, that first field that's always the host name is actually an authority. If you read it, it says, this will often be like a domain name, but it doesn't have to be a domain name. There's a little clue in there that it can vary. Address literals actually they fit the definition. We don't use them that way in the DNS, we mess them around, but they actually fit the definition of a domain name given the descriptions given so far. What happened last summer was someone coming in with a protocol that differed in that it managed names differently. DNS is a centrally managed system. I mean, it's a hierarchy of all these, but each node, each part of the system is centrally managed. Someone is the administrator of that zone. Distributed hash tables is a different way of doing it. It's fundamentally, structurally a different way to manage naming and assigning names. So that's a new way to do this. Etsy hosts was also brought up as an example to me. One of the things people have clung to is that the length of the name is important because all the software out there worries about the length of the name. DNS has rules, or so many bytes for a label and so many bytes for the whole thing. But you can put a name in Etsy host that's really long because in the Unix socket world, way back when, sockets were file names, and file names could be much bigger than an internet address, internet identifier. So there are protocols out there. You can use some of these clients with these really long names, and they work because they fit the old Unix sockets naming rules. And they do look like domain names in some way. And then names that can be commercially registered, I threw in there. That's no source of confusion. In the registration world, it's a business. They trying to get names in there that are not confusing, that are secure, safe, and all this. That's actually a restricted set of what a domain name can be. For example, XX-1 is a valid DNS label, even though no one will let you register it. And all these different rules apply to this. We don't want that to be used for different reasons. So there are a lot of ways domain names have been redefined for different contexts through all of this. I also tried to do FTP, and I was surprised at the FTP definition, because FTP, you go to a host. But the FTP protocol never talks about the host name. It's really a well-compact definition that gets away from the host name, but just talks about the file transfer. It's an interesting definition. They completely get away from how you identify where you get the file from. So I say there are a lot of different ways domain names have been defined over time. So we have this slightly divergent interpretation out there. Next slide. Now, interoperability is what the IETF is all about. And typically we think of interoperability of if you write a software client and someone else writes a software server, if they can communicate successfully, we have some level of interoperability. The more of that, the better. Now, Unbound talks to Bind, Bind talks to NSD in the DNS world, and many other things out there. Interoperability in this case to me is a little bit different because now I'm not thinking about software. I'm talking about protocol to protocol. Can I use the same name on the web as I do for SSH? That's another example of interoperability that I'm after. And that's where I get concerned. Some of my examples where I can use clients in different naming contexts. Next slide. So do we have interoperability? This is the divergent views are out there. Do they work with each other? We have somewhat interoperability. I mean, it's not necessarily a crisis in the world that we have these divergent views. But we also have to recognize that when you talk about any of these protocols developed, you have to say, well, what can I count on? I mean, in the DNS world, we know that DNS labels could be anything, but we are not allowed to use anything because software can't deal with it. Many examples, inter-protocol conflicts make us reduce what we deal with. And one thing I have in here, I have a hook which is going to go into the next presentation, is that sometimes another layer of indirection comes to the rescue. Sometimes we have software hooks that say this name belongs to that naming context, and like .local or .onion and so on. They're going to be done another way, and I'll leave that for the next set of slides. Is there a need to clarify? And this is, do we go through this effort? What is it worth doing this work? It's a important thing for me. Clarifications will always mean something's getting changed. That's pain. We have to go back and fix things. We have to go forward and fix things. So we just don't want to run ahead and just let's do this for an exercise. So next slide. One reason, permissionless innovation. I think that is what's being an issue here. We had this new set of naming systems come into the IETF last summer or middle of last year, and one first thing was, well, that's not an IETF protocol. It's not fitting the way the DNS is put together. It's this radical idea, and I was someone who actually felt that initially. And then I began to realize, well, these guys, they're just trying something new. It's another way of doing things, but they need a space to play in. We want to make sure that they can go ahead and do this experimentation because no one's ever can control innovation outside the IETF can't say what happens outside the IETF. So we need to have a way we have to accommodate things coming from all over the place. Where is it that they can fit into an architecture that allows permissionless innovation? The rubber meets the road part of this. I look at the software out there. I look at an SSH client. An SSH client right now can deal with DNS names. I can see that work, and I can also use SSH between my MDNS, my in-house computer set. I use that all the time. The same client knows this is local. This is going to be MDNS. This is global. This is going to be out in the DNS. And it can also use other things like Etsy host names. And this piece of software has to know. These writers of software are going to suffer if there are so many alternate resolution contexts and they can't scale the time knowing where to send the request. They need to know this. Software needs to know how to send this out there. So that's the question here. Third slide. Next slide. So the time to clarify, I think it's worthwhile going forward with this. We want to be able to accommodate outside people working on protocols, then they hit the IETF at some point. We have to know where they fit in the naming system. There is actually a pipeline of requests for more names to be alternately resolved. .onion was what we talked about last year. There were more requests pending on that. This is not a one-off, not the first time it's seen it. And finally, again, this is not I know we said we're not talking about the special use domain name registry, but that registry to me has a gap in guidance for how to go forward. Now, that's debatable, but that's actually what drove me to think about this. Next slide. Now, okay, so what else? I also have in the draft is I do have definitions of domain names. After looking at all of the ways it's come up, the way it's being used, I try to offer a name definition. I'm not happy with what I wrote. What I wrote was so wide open. I'll finish the slides and then we it's so wide open. It just didn't seem useful to have that. And then Lyman Chapman on the discussion had another definition. Ours agreed, but then again, are these definitions close enough? So that's a place to start. If we go forward with this stuff, with this topic, and there's another document, the definition of domain names, and also the resolution context, I'll take it out of what I have and just say my draft, which is the history and research part, will probably stands by itself. So, but I think that's a good place to start. Next slide. And then knowing the resolution system is the other. I raised this issue at the end saying why I want to know where to resolve something. Again, if that will fit into other presentations and other documents, so maybe that slides out. The next. Next up, I think I've said that. And why is it architectural? I think it's because it crosses protocols. So, George.
Ping. Yeah. It's the on switch. It's
on. It's on.
Okay. George Michelson for yourself. Can you go back to 9, please? So I I have some problem with an attempt to put definitional qualities around all the things you have put on this slide, saying these are all instances of domain names, because they are. They're instances of different domains in a different sense, domains of interest, domains of discourse, domains of application that have name to thing mapping functions, but they are not all domains in the sense of domain names.
So two things here. Sorry to interrupt. We're going to interrupt, or we're going to only have clarifying questions at the end of these.
I
So
think
need a
this goes
question
to
there.
clarifying. I
Okay.
really do, because if you
And
start
number
to
two,
yes,
number two,
yes.
I don't want to bog down on the definitions as much as looking for, I think what he has shown here is that there are multiple things that go in domain name slots in protocols. Whether we call those domain names or not is less interesting, I think, today than how would we figure out how to look those up. And then we can
I'd be
come up
pretty
with
worried-
definitions along the
I'd
way.
be pretty worried about a document that's claiming definitional clarification qualities using language.
So if we were to
Just
have a working group in
isn't
this,
right.
if we were to have a working group in this area, if a document like this was to be adopted as a working group document, yeah, I'd have huge issues with making sure that we knew
Sure.
what
Okay, then-
so this is an individual draft where he's
Yeah.
trying to frame the discussion. So I don't think we need to bog down in definitions.
So I'll skip on that one. The second one is just to go to that quality that you repeated a current meme about the weight of existing software and expectations of the function of the name resolution service. And I have problems with that overhang, because it goes to arguments I've had with people about, can there be a syntax to state this is the space I'm looking in? And there is massive pushback from another community, massive pushback from another community. So there's a quality in that part, which I think is actually raised by Ted Harvey's one, so it's more maybe better to leave, but you touched on it, so I reflected on it. Anyway, interesting contribution, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Clarifying questions. All right, thank you. Oh, one more from John.
Yes, I think this is a clarifying question. Feel free to correct me.
I'll clarify that, Claire.
Yes. My first observation is I've been reading history books, and this kind of reminds me of arguments in the 1930s that Germany didn't really lose World War I. But when I see this, I see protocol switches. Like all the stuff you're talking about for SSH and Telnet and stuff. This is basically the protocol level at which you can say, here's a name, give me back either an IP address or an A record. And one of the reasons Onion is painful is because it doesn't work at that level. It works at a level where give me a name, here's a name, give me a socket. Okay, so I'm wondering whether the concept of protocol switches needs to be in here somewhere.
I'd say let's hold that until we hear the other two presentations. There's some more discussion of that, and then we'll come back to that. I'll call on you again in the discussion phase, because that may be a good part to get in.
No, I was going to say, no, yeah, yes. But I'm just trying to lay, this document's just trying to give what's, and also important, documented history. I avoided all other stories about the history. What's in the RFCs, what's written down, and it's just strictly to get us going on that. But yeah.
In case it's not clear, I agree that simply doing the research to pull all the references together is really useful. Thank you.
Yeah. That's all I'm trying to do here, and I'm really going to leave anything more to how we decide to go forward.
Yeah, and I do think this was useful as input to the discussion. Thank you very much, Ed. All right. Ted?
I'm mildly cut off on the right side. That's all right. I've always been something of a leftist. It will fit me. Hi, I'm Ted Hardy. For those of you on the remote, we're looking at the context of resolution title slide, the subtext of which is 1080p was £4 10 shillings not so long ago. And the point of this is that values actually occur in a context. And if you're expecting 1080p to be a resolution in terms of a television resolution style, and in fact, we're talking in a different context, the monetary context, you actually are going to be somewhat surprised. Identifiers also occur in context. For example, Andrew Sullivan is a Bach proponent of this Bach, and I'm looking for Andrew. So he's there in the back, but next slide. If we actually looked back and saw this guy, a political blogger, we would all be somewhat surprised because we're pretty much going to expect our Andrew in our context, right? So the next piece of this is that the internet is a context. I know we kind of are used to the internet being very, very encompassing as a context. Next slide. In fact, it's kind of a big, complicated context. But at the time a lot of this naming started, it actually wasn't the only context by a very long chalk, right? I mean, there were a bunch of other contexts already extant when this internet thing started. And it's important for us to realize that some of the naming that we're talking about here was really the effort to get internet names distinct from non-internet names. Next slide. So this is actually pulling on something that Ed's research pulled out of the RFC series, and I really appreciate him doing the digging there. And that one, we first started talking about internet names, not necessarily domain names, but internet names. So if you go back to, RFC 819, they actually talk about it in those terms, and I'd actually like us to recover that language because I think it helps with the confusion that George Michael was talking about. Michelson, see, again, all about context. Although I'm sure you have faith as well. The karaoke portion of it will be held outside, not here in Atlantica. And the important piece of that is that what 819 says is that internet names occur as part of a directed graph, and that the uniqueness of a name is because of its place in the graph, right? And we can certainly think of that in terms of IPv4 address spaces, right? We can think about the address spaces as part of directed graphs and see that the critical uniqueness property that we need from address identifiers to make the routing system work is due to that property. Now, in the DNS, we actually see this directed graph property expressed in hierarchy, right? And so the classic case of this is www is, God knows, not unique. Gov is not unique, but www.nasa.gov. Note the no label is unique, right? So we can get this uniqueness by using directed graphs in internet names. That does not mean all directed graphs are the same. Next slide. And in particular, it doesn't mean that all names are within the global DNS. And so here, .local names are part of a directed graph that includes the link as part of the graph, right? So if you think about how that works, I go and claim a name on a particular link, and I am my computer. And if you understand that I am my computer, and you know what link I'm talking about, it's all good. Next slide. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. So the link is an implicit part of the identifier. And it turns out that if we think about these implicit items in this directed graph as part of identifier tuples, this, at least for me, it gets a lot easier to say, oh, okay, there's a tuple, and that tuple is link .local name, and with the tuple, I'm actually okay. I've gotten back to the point where I have the uniqueness property that I need for the internet name because I know all the items in the directed graph. Right? Next slide. Now, this gets back to the other thing about protocol switches. Because, does everybody who actually remembers nsswitch.com first breathe a deep sigh? Now raise your hand. Oh, good. Okay, great. For those of you who don't, please find somebody who raised their hand and commiserate with them briefly, because it's not a fun thing. In nsswitch.com, which still exists, you had things where, like, host resolution on a particular host had an ordering. Like, first you look in the files, then you look in the network information service, and then you check the DNS. And that meant that the answer you got was different than if in the host's directive you first check files, then the DNS, and then the NAS, right? Or even you just check the DNS and files, and NAS, that wonderful thing which disappeared a long time ago, is just taken out of your thing, but you don't actually have it anymore. If you look at this, you realize that there's actually no indication at any of our application protocol levels e.g. the URI, what resolution context is actually going to be used if you are operating in the presence of this NS switch, right? So I've got www.foo.bar.example.com.ar, I guess. Here we are. And if there happens to be the second item here, where I check files in dns.nas first, there may be an entry in there which gives me a resolution that might be different to the one that I would get if I checked the DNS. This is bad. It is not unique. There is a problem here. And in particular, it's bad because the failure modes in the presence of this are irritating as hell. If you've ever had to be on the other end of a tech support line where somebody is saying this absolutely doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is because they're using something where they're checking the files first and somebody has put in an entry, it's almost impossible to debug with an actual user. So this is bad. Let's avoid it. Let's go on. Next slide. Okay, so in some sense, I think what we're talking about here is an NS switch indicator for the internet. What we're talking about is how to make plain the different resolution contexts that coexist on the internet without collision. But secretly, that was a goal statement. You know, we want to be able to indicate that there are different resolution contexts on the internet, that they coexist, and that they do so without collision. And I think that the way we do that is by making the other items in the directed graph or the implicit tuple explicit. I think that's our first step. Now, next slide. How? Here's the problem, right? We all know that the .onion case attempted to make this by, in essence, taking a single namespace and bifurcating it, and there's all sorts of pain involved with that. The draft that I have at the bottom here goes into a few alternatives, and I welcome you to read the draft and think about the alternatives, but the piece in the middle is important because it's ugly. I'm going to step away from the pink box, I apologize. So in the IETF in a peer-to-peer SIP context, we once created this, and for those of you playing the home game, this is overlay node, the DHT hash for the particular overlay. Now, inside an overlay, that's all you needed. So overlay node, this is the node identifier, none of this matters, right? However, the problem was, what if you wanted to talk about this when you weren't already inside a particular overlay context? Well, at that point, you needed a context, and here we have yet a different URI scheme where the overlay is identified by telling you in the global namespace of the DNS where the enrollment server for that particular DHT was, what type of overlay you were talking about, in this case a pastry overlay, and maybe even what example, what resource you were looking for at the overlay node. This worked. We wrote software that did it. It actually succeeded, but it never took off, nor could it. And the reason was this syntax was just too bloody complicated to reuse inside HTTP or email or SIP, because you'd have to figure out some way of taking all of this and shoving the HTTP:// at the beginning and treating all of this up to this resource as the authority. Too complicated, not going to happen. So I think our challenge, and it's a kind of a fundamental engineering challenge, is to figure out how to make those implicit items in these identifier tuples explicit in a way that remains usable within the application protocol contexts. Because if we don't have them usable in the application protocol contexts, the application protocol developers won't use them at all. We can come up with something that says, oh, by the way, everything that you do should have angle brackets, mumble frats, left bracket, right bracket, foo at the end of it, and they'll say, thank you for playing, and squat on namespaces instead. So it's a chewy problem. There's some engineering trade-offs to be made here, but I think it is actually tractable. And I think that's my last slide. All right. Clarifying questions.
Paul's got it.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah, so when you come up to ask questions, use the front mic, make sure you say your name, please.
Paul Hoffman. So this is a clarifying question, not on the interesting stuff you got at the end, both for you and for Ed. I was hoping you were going to do it, both of you, and it's not for the next presentation. The term directed graph.
Yes.
So that's a term that seems to be thrown around by both of you because it's in the historical documentation. There are names that seem to have a directed graph in them, but are always looked up or used as a whole, such as an OID. In an OID, you don't go up the tree. The tree is used for assignment, but not for resolution. In what we're talking about, is that important? Because it seems like the directed part, in many people's mind, is two-way, both for assignment and for resolution. But some of the names, and I think that George Michaels would argue on when he was saying some of those weren't names on Ed's slides, some of those have that property. Is that, so my question is that important here?
So if we're thinking about something like goods, which are
Or goods, yeah.
well, so goods are an interesting example because they're not assigned. They're only cryptographically statistically unique, right?
Mhm.
And so they're self-assigned. They are created, and then they're used in contexts, including contexts like SIP, in protocol slots, which might otherwise have different kinds of identifiers. I think that in that case, the context that we're talking about here makes them almost single item directed graphs, right? Where the fact that the GUID is created in a particular way makes it in and of itself a single term directed graph.
So even if it's a directed graph that might have many terms, but it's not resolved that way, we might think of it as a single item directed graph.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Elliot Lear. Clarifying question, which is, given all this, is it your intent or desire to have a generalized framework for expressing the semantics of different forms of names in these contexts? I'm thinking in terms of, well, you've got UCP bang names, and they had a slightly different approach, and we looked at this, for instance, back about 10 years ago, and 15 years ago, and so each of these sorts of resolution mechanisms can have different characteristics. Are you looking for a way to describe each of those in a generalized framework, or what are you aiming for?
So speaking personally, one, I'm aiming to hold the BOF, and at the BOF, my particular opinion, and the whole point of the BOF is to get more than my particular opinion, is to figure out a way to do enough disambiguation so that you can at least identify that there are different resolution contexts. Now, that may be simply for the purpose to allow you to say, I can't do this resolution, right? This is associated with a resolution context for which I have no appropriate software. I'm not going to go bug some other resolution contexts about it because I know it's different. So if we get at least to that point, I think we've made some progress. If we get past that point, it's all good.
That's a great place to transition to Brian.
Good morning. I'm Brian Trammell. I am not a DNS geek at all. So I'm going to talk about properties of an ideal naming system. Next, please. Why am I here? One day a week, I sit over in the network security group at ETH Zurich. We're working on future internet architectures for routing security and whatnot. The professor that runs the group, came over to me and said, well, you're only here for one day a week, so what can we give you to do that you can do in one day a week that won't block progress on the rest of the architecture? Why don't you redesign DNS for us? That seems like a one day a week job. And I'm not a DNS geek, so I said, okay. And then I started on this thought experiment. If we needed to design this system to do for us what DNS does in the internet architecture, but we know what we know now and didn't have sort of the years of history that we built on top of and the incremental progress on top of that, what would its properties be? And the happy news is that it looks a lot like DNS, but with a few differences, and some of those differences are important. And one of those important differences, I think, is at the root of the problem we're talking about today. So next slide. Who here has read the draft Trammel INIP pins? Okay, cool. For those hands that are still down, I'll go through it real quick. Basically, it's a list of properties of an ideal name system with some front matter and some back matter. It turns out that authority is really actually kind of important, and there are properties of authority you need. You need federation, unity, transparency, and revocability. And this federation of authority is where the directed graph things come from. You need to be able to get authenticity of delegation, authenticity of response, authenticity of negative response. There's been enormous amounts of work in DNSSEC to make this work. This is not an easy problem. You need dynamic consistency. By dynamic consistency, I mean when you make changes to the system, it has to eventually converge to something so that everybody kind of gets the news about the change that was made. And when I first took this to the names identifiers program, I was thinking primarily of just in the internet context, just in the global context, just looking for information that was meant to be public about machines that are connected to the internet and meant to be accessed from outside. And all of the feedback was like, wow, you just forgot 90% of what DNS is used for. These bits of explicit inconsistency, right? So DNS-based load balancers, anything with split DNS, and it turns out any of this special use stuff. And then it would be nice to have explicit support for trade-offs with latency, efficiency, traceability, and consistency. And the document goes into in each section with differences from DNS as deployed. And then outside the ARC and BOF, those of you who have any interest in this, please take a look at the draft and send comments, because we'd like this to be sort of a going back to first principles for guiding future work in this space. Next slide, please. The first insight we came to, maybe this is just because I'm sitting in a network security group with a network security hat, is that mandatory signatures make things way easier. If delegation in the DNS, if this hop to hop in the directed graph is actually a signature, like you use the key to hop to the next key that you need to verify the next thing, whole classes of problems that we have in DNS operations simply disappear. The flip side of that problem is the scary question: who here has a prediction for the date that we get to turn off the last non-DNSSEC server, get rid of the non-DNSSEC supporting client, and just drop the last unsigned zone off the internet? Like next Tuesday, right? Can we do that by next Tuesday? Because I land back in Zurich next Tuesday, and it would be interesting to have that done by the time I get there. There are not that many knobs in the current DNS for basically looking at the performance and privacy trade-off space, right? So for example, one good example is I would like to be able to tell my recursive resolver, I do not care about your latency within bounds. You can wait 2 or 3 seconds to give me this answer. I do not care about how stale the answer is, so you can ignore the TTL, but do not send a packet to any other resolver about my query because I don't want to be traced. Can't do that. Be cool if you could. That's an interesting sort of deprive observation. The scariest insight is that basically every query and every assertion, so an assertion is what we call in this framework an R, a resource record, takes place within a context. And in the current DNS, these are always implicit. So one context would be I'm going to guess where you are based on the subnet of the recursive resolver, which I hope has something to do with the subnet of the client. That's an implicit context that leads to a lot of trouble. Another one is I'm going to assume that you get to see these names because you're inside the network because you came from this side of the resolver and not this side of the resolver. And that's really, really easy to get right, and it's even easier to get wrong, right? So lots of operational problems come from there. And we looked a little bit at how you would add explicit contexts to an ideal name system, and it's hard. And if you want to add it to the DNS, it's really, really, really hard. Next slide, please. So in this context, sorry, alternate resolution is one of these kinds of contexts. And when we talk about alternate resolution with special use names, the context in which that resolution occurs is always implied by the name itself. which is even easier to get wrong. If we were to come up with a way to do this in the present DNS, that we're adding explicit support for just this kind of context, not generalized contexts like geolocational contexts or organizational contexts or civil geographical contexts. Just for this ultimate resolution, there are a few constraints on the problem. The most important one is if I have a name, if I have a thing that somebody typed into a URL bar or has been configured into something or is in a link or there was some human involvement in putting this name where it is, I, at the application side, need to determine how to resolve that unambiguously. Right? So I need to know from the name, this is special use, this is in this context, this is in this context. Or determine that in the current sort of state of the system that I'm on, that it's impossible for me to resolve, and that impossibility to resolve is its own kind of error, right? So, we'll go back to .onion. If I type in .onion and I'm not on a browser that understands Tor, I'd like to get back something other than inx domain. Onion is not in the root. Since basically every one of these ultimate resolution contexts is going to involve somebody adding code to an application or to a library somewhere, and people do that all the time, we like coding, we'd like to be able to add future resolution methods without breaking stuff, right? Like, so saying, okay, well, these are the 17 other protocols that we want to support in the future of alternate resolution contexts, and there shall be no others, is probably not going to work. Unfortunately, beyond that, I don't have a lot of other constraints. So not only is this a hard problem, but we can't carve off large parts of the solution space and say that they won't work. With that, I guess I'll give it back to the chairs to open the
Well,
floor.
let's see if there's any clarifying questions on your deck before we go on. I'm not seeing any. Okay.
Thank you.
So, if anybody wants to look up from their email. We had a couple of questions we thought about to consider for discussion. There's also actually one I'm realizing that I should have added. We have heard references now to historical antecedents to some of these questions, and that there have been many attempts to sort of wander around in the space and solve various aspects of things. And one thing that might be worth considering is, without getting bogged down in details, but where some of those attempts have gone wrong. Right? No, not to dwell on it too much, as my co-chair points out, but where that might actually be, where we might not actually be starting with a green field.
All right. So mics are open for discussion. Go ahead, Dave, and get us kicked off.
This is Dave Thaler. That was my first question. Are mics open for discussion on just those questions, or basically?
No, let's go ahead and this is the free-for-all section. Okay. If you've got issues, I'm particularly interested in people who have ideas about ways to indicate contexts and decide which naming scheme you are in, or if you don't have a way to resolve a particular context.
Okay, so mine is general observations across the three presentations as I was taking notes. And I wanted to tie together a couple things. I did state my name is Dave Thaler, so. I wanted to start with one of the slides that Ted showed, which was, I think it was the first NS switch slide, which had in one of the bullets near the bottom, it had is to be / was. Okay, and so I want to treat that distinction as one axis. Okay, which is one as an indicator of what to do versus an output of what it did do. Okay, so that's one axis. And so I'll put that together with a separate axis, which is, I think I've seen 3 different use cases of resolution in multiple contexts. And by use cases, I mean sort of things that people would want to do for different purposes. Okay. And I think each of the three presenters talked about some of these, and so I just want to collate them all together. I think Ted hit on all three of them. Other people hit on at least two of the three. And so the first use case is where the context is implied by the name. Okay, and so this one clearly fits into the is to be category, right? And so examples is where you, for example, you carve out a space like .local or whatever else it says. Here's an indication of the context. Now it turns out that when you do that, it's still ambiguous because .local is ambiguous because which link is it? .in-adder.arpa is ambiguous because there's multiple net 10s, right? And so in practice, the first one is not a complete solution, it's a partial solution as used today, right? Second category out of three is where the context is based on some other identifier, okay? So you say, well, here's the domain name thingy, and then here's another identifier that's a context identifier. So for example, I want to resolve foo.local on the following link, and so you have some link identifier as an example of that. So it's some outside the domain name or outside of the domain name slot context. It's an external disambiguator. And then the third use case is cases where the context is based on neither of those. In other words, it's not directly visible to the application on the is to be side anyway. It's say done by the administrator, and the NS switch file is an example of that one where the application doesn't do it. And so that one is used when you specifically, when an administrator typically wants to say, I don't want to have to change any of the following application codes, but I want to specify what the context is that I want all my applications to do, either because of privacy reasons, like I'm using split DNS or whatever else. Okay. And so that's a separate axis from the is to be versus are. And so I see this as being a 2x3 matrix of which not all cells make sense, right? Some of them are the is to be and so on. And then to tie those together, I just wanted to note that so Ted gave one example of the desire of was just for debugging, which I agree with, and I just wanted to add that's not the only one. There's also the issue of when I do a resolution to use something and I get something back, right? I follow the directed graph and I've gotten to something. I've gotten to an IP address or I've gotten a piece of information, and I want to use that for something. Well, often the use actually has to be able to disambiguate the context as well. Right, which is the problem the NIF working group was working on. It says, okay, once I've done resolution, if I can get the context back, I can use that to make sure that when I do the connection, if it's an IP address, so I'm connecting in the right context, right? And so, regardless of which of those three in the use cases, I think even if the application doesn't specify is to be, or there's still some ambiguity there, getting back what was is actually necessary, and that's what actually overlaps with the NIF problem. So I just wanted to give a pointer to there, and that deals with the is to be context as well.
Ted Hardy, I got up to respond to Suzanne's question about brief mentions of things which might not have worked in the past when we tried them. And the first of these was an effort that we had, actually David Randy Conrad and I did when I was at Nominum, to try and create a record inside the DNS to point to outside class IN to kind of resurrect the class system. And this does not work. I'm happy to discuss it in detail with anybody, but the short answer is sort of the classic Angela Davis. You cannot deconstruct the master's house using the master's tool. And in this case, it's because of the way DNS delegation works through name servers, you actually can't ever get away from a congruence between IN and other classes. And so I agree with my beloved colleague Andrew Sullivan that we are not here to resurrect class. The other thing I wanted to point out was there's a set of names that we have in our repertoire in the form of URNs, and actually handles work much the same way, where there's a faceted mechanism where the URN colon at the beginning tells you what kind of name you're dealing with, the NID tells you what namespace you're in, and then the NID, the people who control that particular namespace guarantee uniqueness of whatever identifier follows it. There is actually a set of resolution mechanisms associated with those URNs, and there are similar resolution mechanisms for handles. At least in the URN space, the resolution never turned out to be as important as the naming, right? And so we never really got to the generalized resolution mechanism for URNs that the DDDS and other things might have implied. But it is important to recognize that URNs are still out there being used as directed graph names, which are still subject to resolution and which might benefit from an ability to look at resolution contexts. But they're an interesting kind of subcase of where the name worked, but the resolution context did not create a generalized solution.
Stefan Bartmeyer. I will try to address the meta question of what should we do now. In my opinion, the Ed Lewis document about what is a domain name is a very good one, and we should work on it. And of course, I volunteer for review and things like that, because the experience of the DNS sub discussion about the special use domain name registry clearly showed that many people have no clear idea of what is a domain name, and we've heard many things like onion domain names are not real domain names because they are not in the DNS and stupid things like that. So I think that this draft is a good thing, and should be it should be public, not as it is, but we should continue work on this, and I volunteer. For the other draft, I think that the idea of explaining the properties of naming systems, trade-off to do, like in the Brian Trammell draft, it's a good thing, but is it really something for the IETF? Maybe it's something that could be done in the IRTF, or maybe completely outside in scientific papers or Wikipedia articles, because it's useful, but it does not seem to me to be really something for the IETF. So I suggest that we try to find a home for the Lewis draft about what is a domain name, and that we publish it with this the principles that are in this draft, which means that domain names are something that is different from the DNS, and they have some properties that are common to all the domain names. Not a lot, but some.
Right, thanks. And then I'll just note after Stuart, Michael Richardson's in line remotely.
Stuart Cheshire. I agree with the earlier comment that the term domain names is generally understood to mean names as defined by the domain name system, and maybe it would be better for us to use another term. Host names is also probably not right because we're naming things other than hosts. I think internet names might be a good term, and maybe special use domain names should have been called special use internet names. Other quick comment I'll make is I hear people talk about maybe a way to solve this is not just to have a name in isolation, but a name plus a context. And my fear there is it becomes a recursive problem, because you have the context, you need a namespace for naming contexts, and then you might need a context to say which context. When I talk about looking for name in NIS at my company might not be the same as NIS at your company. So I think just adding a context it's turtles all the way down. It doesn't actually solve the problem.
Okay, Michael, we're going to try and bring you in remotely here. I'm pushing the big red button. Go ahead.
And I think I have audio now. Yeah, so my question is, you asked, why are we here? And is our goal to redirect the next .onion discussion? Is that what we're trying to do? We're trying to put a framework around it. And I don't mean that in a negative way, that we don't want to have that discussion, but rather in a permissionless innovation way that someone can go off and would be able to do the next .onion type thing without a big debate on our part. Is that the goal of this potential work?
As Michael, this is Suzanne. As a personal opinion and sort of guideline for this kind of thing, it's not even about the next .onion. It's about the next thing that people need naming and name resolution in order to accomplish that we haven't even thought about yet. And
right,
to me,
the next one, not this
it
one.
would be nice
Next
to
one.
sidestep the problems. It would be nice to not have that set of problems. So in that sense, I think that's a reasonable aspiration.
Anything else, Michael? All right.
Thanks.
Elliot Lear. I was 2 points. I would agree with Stefan that I think it's a good idea to get the document out that explains what a domain name is. We've had this argument a couple of times. Well, seems like perennially actually. I know Ralph and I had an issue with it when the term domain name came up in a DHCP context involving a security domain, in fact. And the person intentionally conflated the term so he could actually overload domain names with security contexts. So having some guidance out there is a good thing. But I just want to, back us off a little bit and ask the sort of pedestrian question. Okay, so what is it I'm going to type in the URL bar when I want to access something? And where do we get to say what context we want to use and who gets to say it? The nice thing about .onion is that it's right there, right? I can type http://whatever.onion, right? If I want other contexts, okay, maybe we have other special use domains for that. I realize we're not meant to be talking about, the whole concepts of special uses here. But the question is, where do you put that context such that you can still have generalized naming within the application that the user can understand? Because the user comes into this picture, actually. These are mnemonics in many cases. That's why, they have form and structure in such a way that they're not random numbers. So I just asked that as a question. I don't have an answer.
So I think, Elliot, from a discussion framing perspective, that's useful. The solutions that people propose will probably have to be filtered through that. What is the user experience, or is there a possible user experience for this solution that is acceptable to the people that might want to innovate in this area?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrew Sullivan, and I now have the problem that 3 things have come up while I was standing in line. So maybe I should grow my beard so that you can all see that it's getting gray. The thing that caused me to get up was Stefan's suggestion that there are a number of things here that are not really IETF concerns. And while I have a certain sympathy for that, if only to reduce work, it seems to me that that isn't quite true. And the reason it's not true is because we are supposed to be concerned with interoperability. And the fact of the matter is that the universe is producing people who invent new schemes for naming stuff faster than we seem to be able to react to it. So that to me is an important observation. And I think this doesn't quite rise to the level of prediction, but I believe that problem is going to get worse, because as the hegemony of the DNS over our eyeballs sort of retreats because of environments like apps and so on, the desire to create new identifier systems within a particular application context or whatever is going to get worse rather than better. So to me, this context question, which is receding a little bit as we sort of skirt towards the DNS-ish kind of resolution, is the thing that we really need to worry about. And for that reason, I have a lot of sympathy with what Stuart said, that just creating a way of identifying context doesn't really help us because we now have a recursive problem. Yet, we do have this issue that we're creating these kinds of things. And if we want an interoperable internet in which these identifiers that leak out into user land can be useful, as an internet rather than a bunch of little silos in which you're in this garden and then you're in that one, we're going to need to have a way of making those identifiers useful. And that to me is really the reason that this BOF is going on. So I think that much as I wish that Stefan was right, I think actually we can't avoid this. And either it's going to come to us later when we haven't thought about it in time, or we should think about it now. And that's why I want to think about it now. Thanks.
Ted Lemon. I think I completely agree with what Andrew just said. Which may shock him. So there are 3 kind of things that have come up as I've been sitting here listening to this. First of all, I think what Ed is doing is really important. I thought the other 2 drafts were very insightful too, and there's probably juice in there, although I haven't, I'm not sure what the context is for presenting that yet. The 3 things that came up when I was thinking about this just now are, first of all, so we tend to think about domain names in the context of either typing them on the command line or maybe I should say internet names just because I like that idea. Either typing them on the command line or typing them into a URL bar. And when we type them into URL bar, then this whole thing about naming is really easy because URLs can have different contexts, and you can specify the context in the URL, problem solved. Maybe. I mean, you know, I'm not asserting that. I'm just saying that you can kind of think of it that way, and it sort of makes sense to think of it that way. But when you're typing on the command line, like when I try to SSH into a server, I don't type SSH space SSH colon / you know, thing or something like that. There's no context in that.
It turns out you can.
Well, yeah, you can, but we don't. And so the distinction I'm trying to draw is that the domain name itself is something that we see in many different contexts. The internet name, something that we see in many different contexts, and in many of those contexts, URIs either aren't typically used, or or that is to say, they wouldn't work, or if they would work, people aren't accustomed to using them. And so that's one of the things that I think is strongly motivating this idea of using the domain name itself as the thing that contains the switch, or the you know, so in other words, the domain name, making the domain name a namespace with multiple resolution methods. And that's something that we might want to think about. Because one way out of this problem is actually to just say, look, we really need to stop using internet names that way. And I think that would be a hard thing to do, and I'm not really advocating it, but I think when we think about this, we should think about, we should be aware that that's what we're implying if we want to go that route. Another thing that came up as I was listening to the third presentation was, I've been assuming, so I've been thinking about this problem a lot, and I've been assuming that the DNS would serve as sort of the resolution mechanism of last resort. So if you don't know what a name is, then you look it up in the DNS. And there are some problems with that, and I have some ideas of problems, of ways to mitigate those problems, but the point that I want to make here is that actually I'm not convinced that that's the correct default assumption. And so we might want to think about that. And then the other thing is that special use names, and I'm not particularly referring to TLDs here, I'm working on the HomeNet naming architecture document. And in the HomeNet naming architecture document, there are names that devices might want to treat specially that are not at the top level. And they would be using DNS to resolve names in that namespace, but they would need to query a different resolver. And I don't actually see a way around that, and I think that that's part of the problem that we're talking about here. So
I just wanted to say, after Ralph, I want to make sure that the next set of people to get up are talking about proposed solutions. So that's where the queue, after the current queue, next people are going to be talking about proposed solutions. But thank you, Ted.
Sure.
Lucy Lynch, NSRC. So I have a real world example of context slipping that's going on right now. And that's in the identity space, where domain names have been used in combination with usernames within protocols like OAuth. And there's already in the wild conversation about number portability and name portability. And I just want to say that given that federated identities were based on the authoritative local domain and the end user's assumption that they own the assigned identifier that's commonly used, is a context slipping problem that will be here very shortly.
Hi, I'm John Levine, but I'm not the John Levine who writes space music in Cambridge, England. Although I get some of his mail. Yeah, I'm not the professor in Scotland. I'm not the professor in Pittsburgh, and I'm not the guy in Phoenix who keeps signing me up for alerts for expensive cars. So, okay, and I think I have 2.5 things to say. One is there's an unstated assumption in some contexts, and in some of the arguments I'm seeing that unique identifiers are better. You know, and one of the reasons we don't like .local is because it's context dependent, and I think we should get over it. I mean, I think, you know, there's 1,000 places called Joe's Pizza, and there's a reason we don't say Joe's Pizza of Podunk, because we can tell from the context. So, returning to what I said before about protocol switches, I mean, I basically see there are 3 ways to switch off on how you resolve a name. One is implicitly by context, which we do all the time. I mean, a domain name in a URL is different from a domain name in an email address. We resolve them differently. I mean, the second is with explicit tags. And as an old mail guy, I can tell you a lot about explicit tags. You know, I mean, and and what's surprising is, back when we had bang paths and whatever the punctuation was for BitNet and stuff, and we had mail programs that actually could look at these disgusting addresses and say, okay, look, here's a piece of bang path and here's an @sign, so I'm going to construct a route and stuff, and it actually worked okay. It wasn't beautiful, but it was, but you could definitely, but given that there was a limited amount of punctuation and you could simply tell people to retype what they saw, it actually worked better than you would think. So I think we might want to go back and revisit a little bit the question of, can we indicate contexts by punctuations, and like if an onion domain were blah blah bang onion, so it was real clear this wasn't an ordinary domain name, I mean, maybe that would work, and that but now we are at a level where, I mean, the reason we have .onion rather than onion : / is purely practical. I mean, it was much easier to hack into socks, so it would work with all the browsers, than trying to go and patch a new context into browsers.
So I did hear a proposed solution in there, which was effectively changing the URI syntax to allow a context identifier to go into a URI or other places where names are used.
Or not just URI, but any name resolution syntax. I mean, as we all know, I mean, the name I typed to FTP, I mean, is going to be resolved by some NS switch thingy into into an IP address, which is really useful. I mean, like on my home network, I have a whole bunch of .LAN addresses. Oh yeah. So the third approach is reserved names, and we always seem to be falling back to reserved names just because, even though they are morally reprehensible, the implementation has been easier.
I will say that reserved names has the issue of, I don't get a diagnosable error if I don't have a resolution context for that name.
That's part of why they're morally reprehensible.
Let's leave the morals out of it. And I'll note that Dave Crocker's in line behind Ralph and is still allowed to talk about meta stuff and not.
So I think, so basically, I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is, explicit contexts are something that I think we should look at, and they probably would lead to standardizing places where we would do protocol switches.
Hi, Brian Trammell. Actually, most of the things I came up here to say have already been said. I have two additional potentially useless observations, but I'm going to make them anyway, because I'm not sure whether they're useless or not. So in one, we're talking primarily about the context of the question, the context of the query, the context of, here's this thing, I want it, and I want it in this context. Is there any use in exploring this problem space and looking at the context of the answer as well? And I make that observation because if you live in this world that I've been living in when I was working on this, and you get to fall back and make the assumption that everything is signed, then the entity that made the signature on the answer, on the assertion, is going to be different depending on which context is answering you. I don't know how to use that in order to solve this problem, but I think that it might be an interesting building block that we can put together. Stepping up one level from that, I think that trying to solve this in a generalized case so that you have a single way to note the context of a query in every, context in which internet names, thank you, Stuart, are used, you inevitably run into the turtles all the way down problem. But if you can leverage the fact that each of these resolutions are happening themselves in different application areas, right? Like, so you can use, like John suggested, you can use changes to the URL scheme in a case where the internet name is within a URL. That doesn't work if you're not using URLs, obviously. But then in some other application, is there a way to hack the ability to bring the context into whatever representation that's using, right? There might be a way to do this. If you can't solve it once for just a bare name, but you can solve it in everything that contains a bare name, and not need another way around sort of thing. I think that's all I have.
Ralph Edward Drums, which I think an unambiguous identifier for me, but I'm not that unidentified.
It's an unambiguous identifier for you.
But I think it unambiguously points to me. I don't think there's anybody else with that particular identifier. I've been struggling with this last bullet, and I think there's existence of useful work that could require a working group, but I think there's other work as well. I sort of hesitate to suggest a research group because I think we did that a long time ago, and I'm not sure what happened there. I want to also point out briefly, we've been talking about protocol switches a little bit, and I want to be careful that although we usually think in a binary world, those protocol switches are not exactly binary. That is to say, there's one kind of switch that definitely says, go do this kind of name resolution versus that kind of name resolution. But there's another one that says, go do this name resolution with these special rules underneath it. And some of the things that we've been talking about perhaps .home or some of the other names that are in the special use registry use DNS, but they have special rules about how DNS is used. And in some ways, those are I don't want to say just as bad. They have just as many impacts in the sense that when they're changed, you have to go change all the implementations because there's different ways of using them within DNS. Yeah, so those were the two big things. But BOF working group, I guess I was trying to organize that in my head to say, what would I write down as the deliverables for a working group with this? And there's some stuff that's not really deliverables, but is work to be done.
So I think until we've got at least one proposed solution that has some kind of legs, it's whether it's a working group or not, maybe a little premature. So let's not bog down just yet on that.
I'm not bogging down, just
We
trying to
did
keep the options
Yeah,
open.
okay, fair enough.
And
Yeah.
Ed's document definitely could use a working group.
Fair enough. All right, we're going to go to Dave Crocker on the mic now. Dave? Don't know if we can hear you. You might be muted on your side. I did. It says he's speaking, but we're not hearing it. All right, Dave, I'll preserve you a token to, we'll interrupt at the line of solutions people. If we get something for you to say, we'll relay it. All right, aside from Dave, everybody in line is to talk about proposed solutions at this point. Good. And be brief, and because there's a good number of these to get through.
Ted Hardy, Cockeye Optimist. I think there are actually two things that need to happen here, and that there are available solutions for both, but that things will go much better if we recognize we need both solutions rather than one. And this goes back to the point that Martin Thompson has made so many times. It's a tuple bitches. Like I'm thinking of getting a T-shirt that says one of Martin's bitches. And the point here is that there's a class of situations where we can make the tuple explicit because we have sufficient protocol slots to introduce the new elements of the tuple with no fear or pain, right? Certainly in network management and other things, we can sort of say, here are the elements of this tuple which make this into a unique identifier by making explicit the parts of the directed graph. So if we say, okay, there's work to be done there to make that a regular method, and then there's distinct work, because there's a set of protocol slots that we know must be useful, where we can't create a new item to the tuple without simply slamming it into the existing contextless identifier. And I think if we extract those two, then for the second half, something like the .alt proposal from Warren Kumari and Andrew Sullivan, where we're saying, hey, there's a part of the internet namespace which we are setting aside. And we are now creating a faceted namespace where a part of that namespace is explicitly going to have mechanisms for identifying alternative resolution contexts. So label alternative resolution context.alt is a part of the internet namespace which has been carved out as a method for allowing it when you must slam all the pieces of your tuple into a single protocol slot. That enables you to reuse it in HTTP or email or SIP or wherever you're going to need to reuse it. That if we say, yes, for those contexts, this is going to be available. However, when you don't have that situation, here's how you do it when you have multiple protocol contexts, multiple protocol slots in order to make your tuple elements completely disambiguated. That if we separate those two tasks and tackle them, I think it's actually pretty tractable. It's work, because there's a lot of engineering trade-offs to be made, but I don't think it's impossible.
Phil Baker, Komodo Group. I think I've got a solution, and I think I've got running code. And actually, we're doing a barb off tonight at 7:20 on the mathematical mesh. Basically, I see separating the space into two. One, machine names, and the second, human-friendly names. Machine names, I use a fingerprint of a public key that is signing, which is at the apex of a root of trust. I'm using that ruthlessly throughout the system. You end up with a lot of cryptography. In the mesh, we do.
I'm just going to interrupt you for just a second because I've read some of your stuff. I think it's very interesting. I'm wondering if you could relate that to how we would sort of backfit it into some of the existing architectural pieces of the internet.
Okay.
Rather than sort of replacing them.
Well, the thing is that once you've got a fingerprint of a key that allows you to validate a statement, then if you've got any way of connecting to that statement, just like Tor, you've got a way of validating a connection to that, validating that resolution mechanism. And the resolution mechanisms can be separate from the way of distributing the data on which the resolution mechanism depends. And you can do all sorts of games there where names are only translatable by people who are authorized.
So I'm just going to interrupt again. Sorry. So for things like an existing email address or an existing URI or that sort of thing, do you see a way of fitting your stuff into that is what I'm asking.
Okay, so with that platform in place, given that you understand I can do all that stuff, okay, so the second part is how do humans relate to this? Well, I went to a bank, I got an account, and then they closed down that branch, and they opened up a branch elsewhere. So the place where I originally resolved bankingness, and I got back this account number, was different. You know, that was a one-time thing. So I see the human resolution piece as being, okay, we resolve the human name to a machine name, and that only needs to happen once, and that particular set of resolution protocol from DNS space or whatever space doesn't need to persist. So long as you've got a way of
and again, I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, but I think that feels like more of a brand new thing, which is interesting, but is not as much about retrofitting the existing protocols that we're sort of trying to talk about, I think, a little bit here.
So what I'm trying to do here is to layer on S-MIME onto SMTP. So the way that I do it is when somebody subscribes, they create a record that goes into the mesh. The mesh is a blockchain type structure. So you've got a statement there that is checkpoint that name to fingerprint resolution binding. That's checkpoint in time. So then say somebody comes up and wants to resolve hallam@gmail.com. Well, I might have given up that name. That might have been allocated to 3 different people. So that when I'm trying to send email, the thing might come back and say, well, that is now ambiguous. There are actually 3 records there. Do you want this date, or this date? But because it's a Harvest.net hash chain, you can absolutely fix those in points in time.
So where's your barb-off tonight?
The ISG meeting room.
Okay, thanks. So I think if people want to know more about that, that's a great place to go.
So my unique identifier is dthaler@jabber.org in a Jabber context, and it's dthaler@microsoft.com in an email context. Just want to state my name. Ted said half of what I was going to say, so I'm going to extend what he said. Right now, I'll just go back to that, which is the goal that I'm interested in solving is to be able to use any domain name slot and have backwards compatibility with any existing application protocol. That's the context that, and the solution was, okay, if you create a subnode of the global naming namespace that is useful to distinguish the context, and I post an example in the Jabber room of www.example.com.globaldns.context.arpa. Which context it is, you take an arbitrary domain name, you stick it under a specific context, and it has just a longer namespace, right? You can have multiple names for the same thing. So I think that's consistent just with a different set of labels than Ted's example, but that's consistent with that. So the part that I wanted to extend on is to say, to go back to, you want to have a way to input that, and I think that's sufficient to say, to understand when I want to pass that in is to be. And on the what did happen, right, if I try to resolve www.example.com and I want to know which one it was, right, there's also existing APIs for getting that back out. So just to take the get header info example, right, what you get back out is an header info structure that contains a field that has AI_canon name. And what that's useful for today is to say, let's say I pass in foobar with no dots, okay, and it uses the search path, and it wants to give you back, so what was the FQDN that you actually resolved, right? So you passed in an ambiguous name, you can get back out the unambiguous name, right? So we have a way to do that too. And so that's why I like this approach here, and I think it can solve both the is to be as well as the what was done solution, and be backwards compatible, and work with any existing stuff that uses a domain name slot.
And I'm just going to interrupt here. We've got Dave Crocker's comment finally sort of streaming in. So I'm just going to read this for him. The problem with looking for solutions at this point is that we don't yet have a community that is clear and comfortable with the issues being attacked. There are probably several. Some concerns are merely distinguishing name registration versus name lookup and wanting different lookup. Others want to augment domain names but still use domain name registrations as a base. Others want a completely independent namespace. The question for these is why? What is the problem with their using domain names? And this last question leads to the concern that sometimes merely adding a meta-naming context specifier suffers on usability. People simply won't adopt the convention. We need more robust community sense of this problem discussion solution space before trying to pursue a solution. I think this is now me talking. I think, Dave, yeah, that's one of the things we're trying to do here is see what the community thinks about this. Stuart.
My name's Stuart Cheshire. You asked for ideas for solutions and you asked people to be brief, so I'll try to do both. My preference on this is to try to come up with textual names that are, to the extent possible, unambiguous. I think the problem with having tuples with some additional context that's added is what I mentioned before. You end up with tuples of tuples of tuples. And however you express those tuples, you can turn those into a single textual string. And given that that's what our APIs take today, it seems like that's the sensible thing to do. Maybe in retrospect, it would have been better if we already had the convention, that if you want a name looked up in DNS, it ends with .dns or .hosts or .nis, and then you would have a way to be unambiguous. I think it's too late to do that. So the alternative is kind of the direction I advocated with the special use domain names, which is we kind of share the root of the namespace. And the problem there that people have pointed out is that if there's a name you've never heard of before, you assume it's a DNS name, and it might not be a DNS name. So that's why I like the .alt suggestion that people are making, that maybe we could make a rule that all new alternate resolution mechanisms fall under .alt. And that way, if client software sees a lookup for .alt for something it doesn't know, at least it does know it's not DNS. So it doesn't leak that out. So I like that solution. These textual names, I don't think will ever be globally unique. Somebody made the comment that there are many Joe's Pizzas around the world, and that's okay. There are many printers called printer.local, and we might want to lecture people, no, that's no good. Give your printer a unique name. Go to a registrar, get a DNS name. For someone who only prints at home, they say, I don't care. Your academic concerns about name uniqueness, I don't care. My iPad works at home and that's good enough for me. So the world is full of ambiguity, And I think we can try to do the best we can there, but we can't make it go away. And then my final comment is a question, because I've heard something repeatedly, and I'm still puzzled by it, so maybe I'm not getting something. I've heard many people say it would be better if we did onion://. And I just don't get that, because the URL scheme tells you, my understanding is it tells you what you want to do. So what comes after that tells you what you want to do it with. But SSH: means make me a login connection. Mail to means send an email. HTTP means fetch a web page. FTP: means use the file transfer protocol. So to say onion://, well, okay, that says look the name up using the onion system, but it doesn't tell me, am I now going to FTP to that or SSH to it? So it seems like that's putting it in the wrong slot in the URI.
Ted Lemon. Yeah, and the other problem with doing clever things like, so the other problem with doing that is that whatever we come up with has to validate in a huge variety of places, and many people are familiar with the issue that you can have a username of like ted.ietf@gmail.com, and a lot of forms won't accept it because their validator doesn't think that's a legitimate username. We don't want to go down that path. I'm not quite as happy with .alt as Stuart is. I think it's a good solution for a certain class of problems, but I think that we need to do a couple of things. I think at present the DNS is in fact, I alluded to this earlier, the DNS is in fact the resolution mechanism of last resort, and I don't think we can do anything about that right now. We might decide to do something about it later, but that's not something for now. So what I think we should do now is say we should define a way of saying in the DNS at the root, this is a special use name. So if you do a query on that name, you will get an answer back that unambiguously tells you this is a special use name. And so if you have a resolver that's written after the time of that publication, presumably it will know to look at that and it will say, oh, okay, I'm not going to send a query to a DNS resolver to answer this question because it's not going to work. And then the other thing is that still doesn't address the issue that we don't really want .onion, the thing that comes before .onion to leak. In other words, when we do the query, we just want to say, we want the resolver to say .onion, is that a special use TLD or not? And then, if it knows how to resolve it, then it can go do the query. But if it doesn't know how to resolve it, it shouldn't send the rest of that payload, the rest of that name. And so I think that we need to specify that for top-level domains, you go find out whether that top-level domain is a special use name first before you do the rest of the query. And I think that scales because you're just querying your local cache, so it's going to have a copy of that information in it. It's not like you're going to be hitting the root all the time.
Ed Lewis, and if I identified myself fully, you'd probably take money out of my bank.
We all get the joke. Not everybody has to do that from now on.
Too far. Okay, so what I want to bring up in solution space, we have an example of something which is somewhat in this area, which is the Mozilla public suffix list. And I'm not saying it's the solution, but it is a mechanism that talks about context of a name, but not necessarily in naming, but in the way you use a name within the DNS. And I think, if nothing else, it's instructive to look at the experience of that and the work going on in that in the debound group and not working in the debound group. That may tell us a little bit about how to go ahead and look for solutions in this area too. I just want to throw that out there for thought.
So I guess what I'm hearing there is something that was distributed so a file that was distributed in roughly the same way as the PSL that would certify, that would say, here's a list of non-DNS.
Right, in the sense of like turtles
levels.
going down has been said a few times, context and all, that would be another way to distribute it, but we know.
That is a solution. Okay, and then Dan York, you're up.
This is Andrew Sullivan. You asked for solutions, and it seems to me that that itself needs some disambiguation, because there are two kinds of solution here. One is, a solution within a particular mechanism. So, for instance, the alt draft that Warren and I have prepared is a solution once you sort of have the theory that people are just going to use domain names according to the way that they ever did, and so we're going to have this carve out of the space that has a tag that tells you, okay, well, now we're into this other weirdness. And there have been some other things proposed in some of the drafts, right? You've got different URI schemes and all the rest of those kinds of mechanisms. But it seems to me there's a second order issue here that also needs to be worked on in order to make this useful, and that is a way of telling people how to pick. What is the strategy that is going to work for your application and so on. And I actually believe that there is some value in preparing that advice. I think that there are people on the internet who, early on when they were preparing, sort of their brand new shiny, we're going to conquer the world with our new naming system, they might look at some of those things and say, oh, I see how this fits into this. That second thing, though, actually sounds to me now like, assuming that we agree that there's a problem here, that actually sounds like the sort of advice that maybe the IAB actually ought to work on. So it could be that some of the output from this, some of the solution output from this is, hey, IAB, go do your job. Which, not the first time. So I think that if we could separate those two things, that would be useful. And then I do think that out of here, actually, there might be some work that is just, if you're going to use this kind of mechanism, here's a way to do it. And maybe this would be a product that we could do, or we could find a working group somewhere in the IETF that wants to tackle that.
Ted Lemon again. I just forgot to mention one of the things that's come up in the specifically in the HomeNet context regarding disambiguating non-unique domain names is to put a UUID in there somewhere that the resolver can use. I don't know that that's really applicable to this working group, but I decided to mention it. And in response to what Andrew just said, I'd really prefer that we have IETF consensus documents to the extent possible, as opposed to IAB documents, although certainly if...
So it's sometimes an IAB sort of statement or direction can help to sort of generate a direction that the IETF does work. But no, I don't think that anybody sees an IAB statement as any kind of binding the way that a consensus document from the IETF.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff in 2862 that I kind of wish were in a consensus document, for example.
Dan York, speaking as myself, not JabberScribe. I've been struggling as I listened to this, as I read the drafts, as working with this, with the questions that Dave raised, and then Ralph's been also raised in the Jabber chat room as well, and Andrew did as well. I think it's hard to get to the solutions that we need in this, because I think that the questions we're asking are good ones, but the reality is, as Andrew said earlier, there's a universe of people out there who are going off, creating their next things and creating naming systems with whatever, because they think that's the way that should be gone, and they just go and do it and write their stuff and whatever, and it's out there and it's doing that. I guess the question I have, as I hear the proposed solutions for .alt, for this and that, is the reality of how do we get people to buy into that solution? How, it's great if we propose stuff, but the question is, how do we get people to actually use it or deploy it, which brings back to the question of, I think these conversations need to happen, but I think we need to bring in a larger group of the people out there and reaching out into those developer communities, others, in order to get there. I don't think we can get to the solutions that I know you want us to be talking about here until we broaden that discussion and bring in more of the people who are creating those systems.
So I agree that we certainly can't come to any conclusions on what a valid... so what I'm more looking for is existence proofs of, are there possible solutions in this space, or is this an IRTF thing where we got to send off a bunch of PhD candidates to go and ideate for 10 years and come back and...
Well, I mean, we're good at going down rat holes and coming up with all sorts of solutions and things. I mean, we do that. It's good. But I think there is this question of how do we get to something that other people will use, and I think for that we do have to understand, how do we get all those people in the room?
Yeah, we were actually quite deliberate about saying we were not confining protocol, the scope of the protocol development that we're interested in. We very carefully did not confine that to within the current IETF efforts.
So I mean, sorry, I'm just going to say one more thing on that. So for example, we've heard some discussions of sort of files that are distributed, changes to the way that names are allocated. We've heard some suggestions about potential URI changes. There's probably 10 or 15 other things in this space that people talk about. Sorry, go ahead.
Ted Hardy, let 1,000 flowers bloom, that 100 schools of thought contend. No. I remain kind of cockeyed optimist in this space, but I want to make two comments that relate to what Andrew was saying about the shape of the solution space. I think Andrew was talking about alt as a portion of the domain namespace, and I think that's the wrong way to consider it. Right? I think we're talking about the internet namespace, and we're talking about carving off a part of it that remains outside the DNS. Now, the DNS may have an NX domain in it. It may actually have pseudo delegations that say each one of these gets its own so that you know where to look. But these are explicitly things which we are saying are not part of the domain name system. And I think we have to look at it in that term of an internet namespace where we are excluding a portion of it in order to enable this. And I think we should do it by faceting the namespace rather than special use names in the root, just for scalability reasons, right? And that comes to a different thing that actually Dave Baylor and I have a lot of experience with, which is URI registrations. For a long period of time, the IETF tried to make URI registrations a fairly formal process where you went through a series of reviews that guaranteed that there was a reason for it and that the new URI scheme was necessary and a whole bunch of other things that added friction and did not stop people from minting URIs, right? People minted URI schemes with abandon, with joy, with glee. They were very happy. Look, my new thing, it's mumblefrats, : everything got a colon for a brief period of time. Now that I say that out loud, it doesn't sound so good. Strike that from the record, please. I'm going to be bleaching my brain later. But the point is, we really need something that has very low friction here. And I think that the point that Dan York was making is there are a whole bunch of people who are following what are blazed goat tracks at this point and creating a road that leads towards squatting in the road. And we have to build a better road for them that's easier to get down, that has very low friction in order to attract them to use that road, which might lead into a faceted part of the namespace rather than the tracks they're currently following. And I think that's a very important part of the usability thing here. I don't think that means we have to solve every single problem by getting every single potential member of the community into a room before we start, because the future is still out there and those people in the future can't join us now. They'd be welcome if their time machines turn them up, but the point is, since we expect these things to continue to grow into the future, we need to meet the needs we have now in as extensible a way as we can, and then keep going.
Paul Hoffman, I'm going to disagree with Dan and with your agreement with Dan and with half of Ted's stuff, and agree with Andrew. .alt today could solve a lot of these future things. Remember, we're talking historical here. 35 years ago, almost no one would come into our DNS as we were building it. It looked dorky. It had a weird protocol on this net that no one was on. It was created anyways. It was created for a certain group of people. They started using it. Other people started using it. Other people started using it. It became valuable this way. It became bad this way. So I disagree that we need to have lots of people in the room before we start working on this. I fundamentally believe that .alt and maybe new URI schemes or not, already today, things that, thoughts that have been around for a while will attract a bunch of people. Maybe they will come in and say, yeah, I'm going to use this, or I am using this. This would have been better. But we should wait till they have them here, I think it's not giving a space for the people who really might want to be using it already.
All right. So first off, I think you might have misheard me slightly. I think I said in order to validate whatever solution we come up with, we need to have more people in the room.
Yes, and I disagree with that. I think
So-
if we have that solution out there, we will have validation or not, and I would be shocked if we
Okay.
didn't get a reasonable
Second
amount
off,
of
so
validation by
I hear
people
what
signing up.
I hear what you're saying on that, and then the other thing I heard you say is you like .alt.
Correct.
All right.
Correct, as a
solution.
solution
All right.
for now.
All right. So keeping going with solutions for the moment, please.
Okay, two comments. One, 404 not found. The thing that really made the web work that other network hypertext didn't work was that the web fails. You don't guarantee that it is always going to work. I think for this particular problem, that's an important thing that you've got to agree on. The second thing is when I was doing Prism Proof email a couple of years ago, I was trying to make email S-MIME really easy to use. I had a whole series of naming games where I was starting off with the question marks not used in actual RS2, the RS2 name, so I tried using that. And then I got into .onion. And then what I got into was, well, really, the fingerprint of the root of trust that's signing this DNS zone, that's really the top level of the zone. So why don't I make that the GTLD? And instead of having .ICANN, you would have the fingerprint of ICANN's DNSSEC signing root. And if you're thinking about what I'm trying to do with making embedded systems trustworthy and not having, that made a lot of sense. So is there a limit on the length of GTLDs that's been, because if we could just say anything over 25 characters or anything over 30 characters is a fingerprint,
All right.
then we don't need ALT at all.
All right. So I hear a solution there, which is anything over a certain length we treat as a fingerprint, and then use that as a mechanism to generate uniqueness. Hear it?
Hi, Aaron Falk. Speaking as former IRTF chair, this is not a solution comment, but there's been a fair amount of how discussed, and I think it's relevant. The IRTF is not a place to do things if what you're trying to achieve is consensus. The IETF is good at consensus. The IRTF is not good at consensus. There are exceptions. It's a great place if you want things to gestate, get a bunch of people together to talk about stuff. But if there has been a pattern of, oh, this is hard, it might not converge, let's send it over to the IRTF. That will probably guarantee it will not converge, not help it converge.
So the only thing that would be interesting there is if there were a bunch of researchers who wanted to do research in this space.
Right. If you've got people doing research in this space, then they will be doing research. They won't be converging on solutions. Researchers are highly incented to come up with different solutions, not one.
Yeah, but coming up, if what we were trying to do is find out, do there exist solutions in this space, and there were people who wanted to work on trying to find those solutions.
Right. But that's an admission that you don't need a solution soon, is what I'm trying to say.
Completely agree.
Dean York, I just want to clarify, I was not saying we have to bring everybody in and have a big, massive kind of discussion around that, because I think that the trick is really what Ted said, is how do we take away the friction and make this something that's a blazed goat trail, as he said. Because the reality is we built a lot of protocols that are out there that people are not necessarily adopting. We need to look at how do we create, whatever solution we create here has to be something that is easy and interesting to the folks that are there. So I guess part of the question is how do we get the people who are doing these new identifier systems, how do we get them involved with creating what these things look like?
Andrew Sullivan again. I feel like I'm trying to restate what I was saying before because I don't think that maybe it came across as clearly as I wanted. The view that I'm trying to suggest is that we have a few different patterns of these kinds of identifiers, and I don't believe that what we're going to get is, I think I agree with Stuart on this, but from a different angle, that we're not actually going to get like one pattern to rule them all. And we're not going to get like the magic context switcher that's going to tell us which context we're in, because then you've got the bootstrapping problem or the regression problem. So instead, what we've got is a bunch of different patterns, one of which is like, oh, it looks like a domain name. Another one of which is, oh, it's a URI scheme. Another one of which is, I don't know, other stuff. .well known is another example of it. There's local parts and email addresses and local part-like things, right? Everybody who comes up with a thing and an @ sign in the middle, oh, it's an email address, except that it turns out that everybody reinvents the rules. So these are all patterns of this kind of thing. And one thing that we can do that's a positive thing out of here that is squarely, I think, IETF work is, okay, we've identified one of these patterns. Let's try to converge on one way of solving that problem and come up with something that we can tell to the world. And so ALT is one of those proposals in one of those kinds of patterns. And some of the work that could come out of this BOF, and I don't care whether it goes to another working group or we find a working group or whatever, that's mechanics. But we could just say, oh, here are some real pattern or some real proposed solutions, and people should pick one of these, and then go and do that. And then there's another piece of work, which could be an IAB job, or it could be an IETF job if people are really interested in this kind of like meta topic, is how do you pick between which style of pattern would be appropriate for your work? And I think those are separate questions, and I think we need to disambiguate them.
That's useful.
Wes Hardiker, Parsons, and my context is the line was finally short enough I was willing to stand up and wait in it. So I'm actually going to suggest that we include one solution in the results that has already been stated that people don't like, which is the nsswitch.conf notion. And the reason being is that when we talk about contexts, there's more than one viewpoint of who wants to determine where a name goes, right? So the user has one notion. When it's applying onion, it's pretty clear. But the reality is that the system administrator or the network administrator has a completely different viewpoint of where you should go based on a name. And so does the end service. So there's actually functionally three different groups of viewpoints that have a completely different belief on where you should go. And split view, is another example of even our DNS space is already fractured. It has been for a long time. We know that there are certain environments, both corporate and government, that redirect you when you're trying to go somewhere that they don't want you to go. So whatever solution we come up with, unfortunately, has to deal not with the viewpoint of a single end user. It has to deal with the viewpoint of the publisher, the end user, and the infrastructure in the middle, all of which want to manipulate our naming context, unfortunately.
So do you think it would be possible for us to come up with sort of a internet scale NS switch that had multiple layers of inputs and policies associated with it?
So the NS switch is not internet scale. That is the local context, right? So
it would be a new thing, sort of using that as a metaphorical starting point.
Yeah, I have to say, so out of all of the solutions, be it a new naming space, be it .alt, be it, we should really use URIs, which I now agree is not correct. I don't like any of them. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I have not seen a solution yet that I think is fantastic. I mean, the reality is that we need the end users who we have to please. The end users these days are very, very simple-minded. They don't like typing HTTP, which is why we've made the default protocol context HTTP for them. So when they type something in the box, we don't send them to an FTP site, right? We're making the guess that they don't want to go to an FTP site or a Gopher site, right? Even though most browsers still support, those protocols. So what's the default naming convention? Unfortunately, that'll likely end up being application determined. A Tor browser is likely to be a Tor naming context. The web browsers are likely to be DNS first. But I could very much see a preference of, where do you want to try first? Because privacy gets into this whole mess too, right? Where, as somebody stated earlier, I don't really care how long I get a response as long as you don't tell anybody where I'm trying to go. That is a privacy bubble. When I configure sound in my application, it says, where do you want to send sound to? And I give it a list of preferences, depending on whether my laptop is docked or not. I want it to go to the speakers when I'm docked, but not otherwise. So there's a priority list. And that's what an nsswitch.conf file actually did.
Thank you.
Phil again, sorry. It strikes me that we may have a nomenclature collision.
I'm sorry, again.
A nomenclature problem here.
Oh.
In that, what are we meaning by context? For me, context is exclusively what the person interpreting the name brings. The context is, I want to do chat, I want to do mail. That is context. We're also using it, though, in a sense of it's something intrinsic to the name. And I think that we've got that wrong. Because when I think about that, there's two types of naming scheme. There's one where you take random numbers and fingerprints or whatever. That's one. The other is where you have a registry. And I think that when people are saying context, what they're actually implicitly saying is the authority under which the registered naming scheme is interpreted. And I think that if we distinguish between those two, we may get to clarity sooner, in that probably what the problem here has been a collision of different people not willing to come to an agreed.
Well, I mean, it's also possible for, as just a, to play community's advocate for a moment, it's possible that we haven't heard a good enough solution yet, which is why we're still sort of batting back and forth the half solutions that we've heard. So.
So I watch Phil sit in my seat. I'm Dan York, and that is my seat. No. So on a solution side, I would volunteer to help work on something that looks at, because I think Phil's actually right in the sense that we're talking about different contexts in different ways that these naming systems are used. So I think some bit of work needs to look at where are these naming systems being used, in what context, in what ways, because I think that's part of what drives us toward what we can possibly do and if there's work to be done in here. Because if we ultimately talking about what happens inside of browsers, for instance, then maybe there's not much we can do here unless the browser vendors decide to go and do what they're going to do. And maybe there's not a role for the IETF. But I'd be willing to work with somebody or anyone who's interested in putting a bit around that. So I'll volunteer for that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tim Shepard, and I tried to follow what the MIF working group was doing when it was starting up. And then I don't know how many years ago that was, but it feels like it's been several years since I've looked into what they're doing. But I believe when they were starting, and maybe someone else here could answer whether the question of whether they actually came up with any solutions. But one of the problems that they were trying to figure out how to solve when they were starting up is, imagine your laptop or your device you're carrying with you, you associate, maybe you hook it up to a wired LAN, which is inside a corporation where they're doing split DNS. And at the same time, you may associate with the Wi-Fi access point, which might be your phone providing a hotspot through which you are doing a VPN tunnel back to your home corporation, which is also doing split horizon DNS. And now what is a user to do when they type a domain name in? Which interface is that split DNS thing supposed to happen in? Or are they typing a DNS name in that's supposed to refer to a DNS name that's in the actual internet? And that group was going to try to figure out, if I understood correctly, what should we do? And it's a hard problem. And I'm wondering if if they came up with anything.
Does anybody know anything about MIF in the room? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so the RFC that you're looking for is RFC 6731. And tragically, it specifies how to deliver the information that you might need to use in order to do what, sorry, Mr. Nan? Yeah, what Tim described, but it doesn't tell you how to implement it. And this is really exactly the same problem that we had that I was just talking about earlier with home nets. So.
Andrew Sullivan, and to follow up on that slightly, the reason, of course, that it doesn't is because, well, April 1st has just passed, and I've been threatening for years now to publish the Do What I Mean RR type, which is fascinating because it doesn't actually need a type number because, of course, you know what it's going to be. So now I don't have to, you all get it. The point here is that the problem we're really fundamentally trying to solve is that users want what they want, and we don't have a mechanism to do that because it's up in user land and we suck at that. But it still seems to me that we could focus this we could do some practical things for application developers. And I think that that was part of the focus of this BOP. And that's the reason that I'm concerned that, you know, we're not focusing on these different kinds of scheme things versus like embedded names versus .well known and so on, because those are all different things that are, you know, going up into user land. And there's going to be some point at which you're going to get both of these at the same time, and that's not going to be fun. So it feels to me like coming out of this really needs to be some sort of effort to work on the individual pieces of it. And I guess I'm wondering whether maybe the BOF chairs, because this is not a working group forming BOF, so we need to figure out like what sort of next things would be. But I'm wondering if maybe you could like list a bunch of, sorry to do this from the floor, but it just occurred to me, so I'm gonna whether we could just like have a list of some of the approaches or the styles, I guess, that I was suggesting earlier, whether there are people who have energy to work on any or all of them, or what all. You know, do you have a scheme thing? Does anybody have a candidate, and so on? Do we have an in-band name thing? Do we have other kinds of stuff? And maybe we could get started that way.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to bring up Ted's slide here. In theory. I'm sorry, where? Oh, got it. Hang on. Oh, which is linked in the presentation. The draft. I'm connected through my VPN, and all of the Cisco security stuff is protecting me from the bad links.
I will say we've been taking extensive notes, and I'm looking forward to integrating them, because actually, Andrew, I hadn't thought to do that here, but I'm hearing some resonance with working on a couple of these drafts, and frankly, I think that will be, if we can get people to do that, that points towards practical next steps about which pieces of the space are interesting and useful to attack.
I just wanted to point out this potential solution nobody talked about on the floor of using something that's like XN -- to signal that this label is swapping out to a different context. So which other ones did you want me to highlight, Ted? Do you want to come to the mic? So there's the .alt thing.
Ted Hardy, it's quite possible that you could retitle this "The Bad Idea Fairy Visits You," because I'm not necessarily saying that any single one of these is the right idea. It's just pointing out that there are existence proofs. The first of these was .alt. You go back up a little bit. The other is completely unattractive because it attempts to either fix the top set of top-level domains, not our business, or the number of resolution contexts, not possible, so leaving that out. The other possibility here within the DNS is to actually use something like XN -- within the UNet, within the DNS context, so that you could have that as a delimiter. So anytime you saw, let's say it's XX -- you would know that that particular name came from a different resolution context, and that what followed was the resolution context. The only reason I can see to do that over .alt, frankly, is if you had names which were in mixed resolution contexts, where you got some aspect of the name from the DNS portion of the internet resolution context, and some aspect of the name from an alternative resolution context. That's a bit of a corner case, and frankly, I don't necessarily think that it's a great notion.
So I'd say there's one other thing that is potentially useful there, is that you could do interesting UI stuff in the same way that we show XN -- as the internationalized label in a lot of UIs. We could do something similar with not having to show all the XO or XX
Right.
or whatever.
So you could even say that this is an elided label, right? Which would not necessarily have great security properties.
Agreed.
A different, as I said, this could be retitled The Bad Idea Ferry Visits Here. The other thing is we could do more than one of these, right? So a URI registration convention that says any URI with a facet ++ resolution context can be assumed that the following identifier is in that context. And if we did that, then if you had HTTP, you automatically had HTTP ++ onion if you had the onion shin. This goes back to the kind of the blazing it trail portion of this, right? There are a lot of these which are entirely possible, but maybe too ugly to live. And so they're mostly in the draft as existence proof, but there are clearly a bunch of different things you can do.
So, I see .onion being used as an example quite a lot here. I mean, are there other groups coming to us asking for solutions? And, could they please write down in a draft what exactly they want us to solve for them?
We have 10 of those pending at the moment.
You have 10 of
And
them.
so one of the questions is, do we have an approach that we would suggest for these folks?
And by those you mean, requires people who want to register top level, okay.
Non-DNS top level.
Is there any indication that those groups would accept like a redirect, go do it someplace?
And we explicitly declared that out of scope from the beginning, so let's not talk
I'm
about
asking
that.
about applicability. I mean, are we producing solutions, talking about solutions for a real problem?
It is possible that you could grandfather in some set. It's possible that you could go back and ask them to, but let's not get bogged down in that. All right. Does anybody have anything else they want to say on the topic of how do we go forward, the approaches we ought to take, where work ought to be done, that kind of thing? Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah, we're running out of time, so we're trying to come to some conclusion.
Ted Lemon, just very briefly, there's a couple of things that have popped out of the HomeNet architecture document that I think are relevant to this, and this might be the place to do them or it might not. And I also think we should do Ed Lewis's document regardless, but that's.
Okay, so I haven't yet heard, for example, an idea that had enough clarity that we could put a working group forming BOF behind at a future IETF meeting yet. And does somebody want to disagree with that statement?
Ted Lemon again. So I'm not sure I want to disagree with that. I have a document that has a bunch of which is it's I don't know if it'll be adopted, but it has significant implications on this problem space and might require a working group in which to do them unless it happens in HomeNet, which I think wouldn't necessarily be the right thing. So, but unfortunately, that's a little bit of it's a little bit vague. It's not. I'm not actually answering your question. I'm just telling you that I think an answer to your question is impending.
Is
impending.
Okay.
So I mean, I think that ultimately we are going to probably have to have that conversation, but I don't know that we're quite ready yet.
Fair enough.
Ted Hardy, cockeyed optimist. So I do think that there's work here we could have a working group forming BOF around, and I think you could start by saying, look, we're talking about fastening the internet namespace and resolution contexts, and the first element of that business could be, what does it actually mean if we create .alt, right? Does .alt then exist in the DNS? Yes or no? Does the .alt exist in the internet namespace but not in the DNS? What are the registration mechanisms that .alt really needs to be low enough friction to be attractive, but high enough that we don't get collision, since those are really our criteria. And then the working group could go on to say, hey, now that we have this mechanism that allows us to deal with multiple resolution contexts, are there methods other than this DNS name-based or internet name-based system to make explicit the other implicit parts of the tuple? So I think you could construct a charter between now and Berlin that it would be worth getting into a room and arguing about.
So I will say that outside the room, and I'm just going to sort of funnel in some of the feedback I've gotten outside of the room just to speak against what Ted just suggested. There are a bunch of people who have told me that .alt doesn't meet their needs from a user experience perspective, that it makes them feel like they're in a sort of ghettoized part of the internet, etc. And so that would not be an adequate solution for the kinds of things that people want to solve. I think we would have to have at least some kind of agreement from folks that currently feel that way, that this work would be worth doing in order to really make doing a whole BOF and setting up a working group actually be worth it, as far as I personally am concerned. But I'm interested in other people's opinions on that. And go ahead, Dave.
Dave Taylor, I just wanted to agree with Ted, and I'm interested in what the issues are since I haven't heard that myself, but having that here right up would be good input to say that BOF. But I agree with Ted that I think that there probably is sufficient material around a specific scope that one could construct a BOF for next IETF. Now there's some work that would have to be done between now and then, but I'm convinced by the things that have happened here that there's enough that we could in fact talk about there. And I go back to the relationship between the alt stuff and the public suffix list are all different ways of solving the same problems. How do I get the notion of a context disambiguator as part of the domain name slot someplace? Okay. And I've seen at least 2 variations of stuff. I think there's enough there that we could actually have a BOF for next time with some work between now and then. So that's me agreeing with Ted and disagreeing with your original assertion that it doesn't look like we're ready for one for next time.
Dan York, first channeling Dave Crocker as Jabber Scribe. Ted has the premise that our inventing a mechanism for avoiding resolving naming contexts will be useful. I suspect that we do not have a basis for expecting that it will be sufficiently appealing and usable for real-world adoption. And Dan York, wearing my personal hat, I will say I agree with you, Joe. The comments I've heard, and Dave, I can relay them to you as you wish. I've heard from people who are working in this. Some of the authors of those other drafts that are out there for the 6761, who have zero interest in changing to another alt domain. Now, having said that, could it be useful as guidance for somebody in the future who wants to create their new thing? And could we potentially help corral people into a fewer set? I don't know. But to your question, Joe, I think there's obviously a challenge here, that we have a problem that is out there that we as IETF potentially could work with. I think there's value in exploring it more and looking at, moving these drafts along that are out there, looking at what is the space, what are the needs that are out there, what can we do with this? So I think there's value in continuing the work. Does that get us to a BOF for next time? I don't know exactly, but I think there is value in that.
And we're cutting the lines. And yeah, we're almost done. So,
Mark Nottingham, I am one of the people who gave you that feedback outside the room, albeit under the influence of a lot of beef and Malbec. So much beef. I think the alt as ghetto is a personal feeling. I'm not currently designing a application that needs this facility. What I would suggest is that Berlin might be an interesting target, because for whatever reason there's a community there of people who do have interest in this area, and that seems like a really nice opportunity that we should take advantage of.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful.
Ted Lemon again. So .alt definitely serves a purpose. The document as written is, in my mind, totally unacceptable, but the pieces of it that are technical serve a definite purpose and would definitely resolve some use cases and create some reduction in friction. So it's definitely worth doing, but I agree with the whole ghetto thing too.
All right, so I'm sorry. So what I think I'd like to ask people to do is all of the great ideas that have come up, particularly those that don't yet have drafts associated with them, please write a draft and send it to the Arcing mailing list, right? And that will be one of the most helpful things that you can do in order to move this discussion forward.
Yeah. The other thing I'd like to see folks doing is we've heard mentions, we've heard conversations in here about several IETF working groups and several technology efforts that do have these issues in front of them now. And it would be really good as part of advancing our thinking to make sure that we're maybe getting into working groups we wouldn't normally go into to see what issues people are really up against, because I think that actually will inspire further thought about where we can go with some of these things. So yes, the mailing list will be staying around. Yes, we've also heard, I've been taking notes, and there seems to be quite a lot of support. If you want to work on any of these drafts, I know that all of the draft authors, started this work in hopes it'll be useful. So, another thing to do is bring discussion of the drafts to the mailing list, send text to draft authors. And I think we'll be writing, Joe and I have to go sort of huddle and write an update to the list of what we heard and what might be useful to continue. And Dave Taylor just became my new best friend because I don't know yet what a charter would say for another boss. So
let's leave that for another day. So I was making sure that the sponsoring AD didn't have anything else to say. He doesn't. All right. So with that, thank you and happy lunch.